Welcome to the XY Advisor Podcast, a global community of financial advisors sharing and learning with one another to drive the positive evolution of financial advice. To get involved, go to xyadvisor.com or simply download the XY Advisor app.
This episode is proudly sponsored by Integrity, your partner for life. Integrity recently launched an exclusive research paper to help advisors understand how to attract and retain new clients. They believe their role in the industry is bigger than just providing products. They want to help create a sustainable industry, educate clients, and support advisors personally in their business. You can get a copy of the report and learn more about Integrity if you visit integritylife.com.au/XY.
Welcome back to the XY Advisor Podcast. I'm Fraser Jack, and today I'm joined by Graham Rich. Welcome, Graham.
Kia ora, Fraser. How are we today?
Very well, thank you. One of my fellow Kiwis coming at you, and in fact, not just one of my fellow Kiwis. One of the people who are from the south of, went to Otago University. One of the people from the south of the country. I'm hoping you're a Highlanders supporter as well.
No, mate. I'm a Crusaders supporter and have been from the inception of the Crusaders. So that shows how old I am. I was around way before the Crusaders started.
There you go. Now you're of course running a you're the CEO, you're the dean of an organisation called Portfolio Construction Forum. Do you want to give us a quick overview of that?
Well, I should also give a quick qualification. I've lived in Australia for over 25 years, so I still have kids, grandkids, all the family in New Zealand apart from my wife and myself, but I have a really strong affinity in the Australian marketplace. So going to your question, Portfolio Construction Forum is a specialist and independent provider of a whole raft of continuing education services, CPD services. We call it postgraduate education content. In other words, what we don't do is training to help individuals become financial advisors or become involved in the investment space. But once they are involved, they've met the regulatory requirements or the basic education requirements. Our business is somewhat unique in Australia and New Zealand, and we have New Zealand clients as well as Australian clients. Somewhat unique because we focus on a whole array of specialist content in the investment space, helping people do a better job of building quality investment portfolios or interpreting and helping their clients understand investment portfolios. That's our business.
Well, fantastic. And there's sort of two main areas of that business, isn't there?
There are. We are responsible in the Asia Pacific for a certification called Certified Investment Management Analyst, which is openly for the pointy heads. It's for young advisors who really have a deep focus on technical aspects and want to develop their skills as really strong investment advisors, so Certified Investment Management Analyst, and we run a program then called the SEMA Society, which is for SEMA certificates. That's quite a technical program, and we then have another special interest group called the Phenology College, and we may talk about phenology a little bit on the way through, Fraser, but phenology is this mongrel word, half Fin, behavioural finance, and half-ology, investor psychology. So that's phenology. It just saves me saying two words, or four words, I guess. And so Phenology College is for those who are really keen to keep developing behavioural finance skills and investor psychology skills, so they're better at connecting between the investing pieces and the investor pieces, the client pieces. So those are the two things we do. SEMA Society and Phenology College are the two kind of schools that we run inside Portfolio Construction Forum.
Yeah, fantastic. And you're absolutely right. We will dig a little bit deeper into this Phenology College because phenology is a word that, you made this word up, didn't you?
Well, I stole it. And I started a business called Morningstar. Before that, it was called FPG Research. And one of the key things to understand about research is it's essentially theft with a kind of wrapper around it, because research is all about poking around everywhere else, gathering stuff and packaging it up and saying, here's some research. So I started a research business in 1983, which ended up being called Morningstar when I sold it to them in 1999. So having finished at Morningstar 2001, Portfolio Construction Forum started, and this phonology space is a word that came from a bloke in the US called Dick Wagner, who is one of the founders of the Financial Planning Association in the US. He's passed away now a number of years, and he was always on about how do we make the concept of investment advice connect with investors. So I'm the one that came up with the idea of, well, if I interpret phonology, the two words that connect with me are behavioural finance, the fin, and investor psychology, the ology. So I made that bit up. You're right. It's a mongrel word, though. It's a bit like webcast or podcast. They are all what are called portmanteau words. They're smashing words to get Microsoft. There's another one. Motel. There's another one. They're these kind of mongrelized words which come together and make it easy for Kiwis, especially. Instead of saying four words, we can just say one.
Yeah, fantastic. Love it. Love it. Love it. Now, obviously, you mentioned you started up a business, a research business that later was purchased by Morningstar. But before that, let's go back a bit further. You were, again, as we sort of mentioned, you grew up in New Zealand. You were you started your investment portfolio, and certainly when it comes to products, at the age of 14. It wasn't like you'd left school and done things.
I had a paper round, and so I had a significant income stream. Obviously, every morning, mostly my father. I was the kid of a couple who eloped from South Africa, moved to New Zealand. I was born in Auckland, and Dad and Mum, but Dad particularly had a really strong work ethic, and got me into this paper round that I started about 9 years old. 14 years old, I had an income stream, and Dad had his AMP agent meet with me, and I remember that distinctly because the AMP agent met with me at his request with Dad's approval. Dad left the room and left me to it, and I ended up buying a whole of life policy, which I have to say I was incredibly proud of. I remember distinctly telling my mates at school that I had a life insurance policy. I was really proud of it, $50 a year. So I started that at the age of 14, which for those of you who want to calculate that out, was about 1968. So I was pleased to have the beginning of understanding investment stuff. The fellow who sold it to me explained what was going on. I remember distinctly meeting with him in our little 2-bedroom house. So that was my beginning experience that I think, Fraser, influenced my future career.
Yes, absolutely. I would 100% agree with that. The old whole of life policy, small amount of investment and a bit of life insurance in it. And then, of course, when you went to university, we sort of talked about that. But then afterwards, you sort of dived straight into the industry as a fully qualified, or when I say qualified, you had a degree, and then you started in financial advice industry.
I just did what I did. I didn't kind of think of how significant it was, but when I look back now, I think it probably was significant because in 1975, I was 21 years of age. I'd finished a degree at University of Otago in psychology, and I took my first job, as I thought of it. I didn't realize that I didn't have a job at all. I'd started in a self-employed role as a life insurance agent, working under contract as a sole agent to Norwich Union Life Insurance Society. Now, most people probably never heard of that now because it's disappeared. Turned out to be called Aviva. And then the life insurance part, I think, in Australia was bought ultimately by NAB and MLC. But I started as a life insurance agent. I was the first life insurance agent who had a degree working for Norwich Union, at least. And secondly, I was by far the youngest they'd ever employed, 21 years of age. But I still think in feet and inches, Fraser. I'm 6'4". I was before I started shrinking, I guess. I'm 6'4", and I've, always kind of looked a bit older than I really am. And so at 21, I kind of could hold myself reasonably well, and nobody said, "Well, that's awfully young." And I got into it, thoroughly enjoyed my role, and began in the financial services industry through life insurance. Became sales manager by the time I was 24. Became South Island manager for New Zealand by the time I was 26. National marketing manager by the time I was 27, and then left and started my own business, which is what turned out to be the Morningstar business on one side and a financial advisory firm on the other. So my career has been, and I hark back to this life insurance policy that I bought and say, whatever reason, I had an affinity to this stuff.
Yeah, fantastic. And your career, I describe your career as something that the current XY advisor community is going through, qualified, coming through, working for a business for some time, starting your own business. Now, talk to me about starting your first financial planning business.
In 1980, I had a national management responsibility for Norwich. And 1980 was the beginning of as it was called in New Zealand, at least, the investment-linked life insurance kind of movement, where whole of life type stuff, endowment type stuff started splitting apart, and here's the investment piece, and that really captured my imagination. I have to say, I had a younger brother who worked for me in a financial planning practice that he owned. He passed away when he was 33 years old. He'd been 2 years in the business of running a financial planning practice in New Zealand, and he had a huge amount of life insurance, which he only would have taken as a consequence of the role that I got him involved with. So I want to put a stake in the ground and say I have a fundamental commitment to the role that life insurance plays, and I have personal experience in the fact that my brother's wife raised a 4-year-old and a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old through without having to work because of the significant amount of life insurance she had. So let me put that stake in the ground first. But notwithstanding that conviction of the role that life insurance plays, my passion was around investment stuff. And so in the development of this unbundled life insurance movement, some in the US called it universal life. Unbundled is what it was ending up being called in New Zealand. To be honest, I don't know what it was called in Australia, but it was called unbundled.
Yeah, I've heard it described here as unbundled as well.
Yeah, and that was the splitting up of life insurance into the component parts. And in many respects, that was the beginning of the demise of the traditional life insurance agent. And so in the very early 80s, 81, 82, I had a national marketing role as part of what I had responsibility for Norwich. I was still a young buck, and in my mid-20s. And so I went on a study tour to the US for 5 weeks, looking at trends in the development of financial services, universal life, investment advice, and so on. I became a member of what was then called the International Association for Financial Planning, the predecessor to the Financial Planning Association, as it's now called in the US as well as here. I started the Financial Planning Association of New Zealand, which happened to be called IAFP. And I'm still a life member of that. I guess you become a life member for life. that's what really started my interest in the financial planning or the financial advice or the investment advice world. So I came back to Norwich and said, this is the way we ought to evolve. And the fellow who was the head at the time of Norwich was a Scot. He's since passed away, so I can be even more rude probably, but he could not see what I was on about, because my argument was we ought to stop having life agents and start having financial advisors. He was like, no, we don't do that. So literally I said in 1982, well, in that case, I'll do it myself. And so I left Norwich at the end of 1982 and the beginning of 1983. I started a business called Financial Planning Group in Christchurch, and it was, as it happened, the first independent financial planning practice in New Zealand. There were financial planning practices in Australia at the time, but very few. Like on the one hand, you could count them. And so I started the first financial planning practice, and the rest kind of is history. The few other businesses I've started and sold, and including that financial planning practice. And I'm super proud to say, Fraser, sorry for rabbiting on, but that financial planning practice is still in existence today after me having sold it. And I'm really, really proud of that, because it shows the longevity of the financial advice profession, if you like, from my start of 83.
Yeah, fantastic. And it's always nice when somebody says it can't be done and then you turn out and do it, and it's lasted all this time as well. So back then you also started the research business, and this is the sort of to me this is a bit of a trend you've got. The financial planning arm, the belly to belly conversations with clients. You're still helping in that way with what you're doing now, but also you had this research business for as you say, the pointy heads.
I started a business. So Financial Planning Group was one business I started, and just to show you that I perhaps sound cocky. When you look back at the time, you never were cocky. So I started on the 1st of April 1983 because I thought if it was a joke, and failed, that's what I'd say. I started at the same time a company that was called FPG, Financial Planning Group Research, and that was the research business. And those two businesses were the first two businesses I started. In due course, I started 3 or 4 other businesses on the way through, but every one of those businesses was about providing support services to financial advice and to financial advisors. In due course, I sold the financial advisory business because of what I perceived as the conflict of running an advisory business as well as offering services to other financial advisory businesses. So the research business is what won out, and that's essentially because my passion was around service provision to advisors, training advisors, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of other things I started, little businesses, all grew, prospered, and I sold, and they carried on.
Yeah, fantastic. And tell us about your move to Australia then.
So the research business prospered to the point that in about 1988, 89, and through 1990, I extended the research business and had some staff in Australia. So I was traveling a lot from New Zealand to Australia, growing the research business, grew it to the point that I ended up moving here in the mid 1990s, and kind of flipped the business inside out. So I sold off the 2 or 3 other little businesses I'd started, an advisor training business, an advisor software business. I sold those off. They are both still operating. They're absorbed into other bigger businesses. I'd sold the advice business quite a bit earlier than that. So here, this research business was my passion. By mid-90s, it had grown in Australia to the point that I decided to move over here, 95, moved over here and flipped it. So the Australian business became the principal corporate, with the subsidiaries being New Zealand-based subsidiaries. And then by end of the 90s, 1999, right, in fact, before the dot-com crash in the US, I sold the business 1st of April, as it turned out, 1999, to Morningstar US, and the Australian business of FPG Research changed its name to Morningstar Australasia for Australia and New Zealand, and was the first international expansion of Morningstar US. So they had me as an experiment. I certainly had them as an experiment as well. And we worked our way through trying to establish a business that was the Morningstar way of doing things, but built on what FPG Research had evolved by that point for 17 or 18 years.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, this is really fascinating because, as you said, that the Morningstar business was only in the US at the time.
It was.
How did you then find such a business to come and buy your little research business over on the other side of the world when that wasn't something that they did?
Well, that's another interesting question. There's a lady called Ruth Richardson, and some people may have heard of her. Ruth Richardson was what Australians would call the treasurer for the New Zealand government. She was what New Zealanders call the Minister of Finance, and she happened to have her electorate in the Christchurch area. And when she retired from politics, I asked her if she would be my chair. And so I formed an independent board of directors. I didn't need to. I owned the business, but I formed an independent board of directors. That board of directors was chaired by Ruth Richardson, and we set up a strategic plan, and the strategic plan recognized that we were not going to succeed as a research business in New Zealand without a strong connection externally and globally. And so that's what, if you like, precipitated me moving across to Australia. But the agenda in moving to Australia was to grow Australia to the point that the Australia corporate with a New Zealand subsidiary was attractive to internationals. So I visited every year to the US from 1982, in fact, on. Every year I spent time in the US, and always about September. So I had built up a relationship with 3 or 4 fund research companies in the US. Lipper was one. There was another firm called Value Track. There was another firm called Standard & Poor's, some of you may have heard of, and this firm called Morningstar. So I went and did a special visit to the US to go and pitch to these 4 groups to say, here's what we do. I reckon there's opportunity because we own the research space in fund research in Australia and New Zealand. FPG Research, we've got 10,000 funds on our database, blah, 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 blah. What about talking to us? Well, Morningstar said no. And then maybe 3 months later, they came back and said, actually, can we talk? And that took maybe 6 or 9 months. And eventually the deal was done and took effect 1 April 99. So it was a long, protracted process that began with me pitching to 4 different groups.
Well, fantastic. So that was a lot of hard work. It wasn't just about the pitch. It was about the advisory board. It was about setting up some governance and structure. And there was a lot of and a lot of relationships, leaning on the relationships that you'd made in the US.
Look, honestly, I very rarely talk about this. So it's a bit of a privilege. Thank you, Fraser and XY, but it's also exhausting to think about because it was a huge amount of work. But I kind of had my eye on the goal, and I had this lady called Ruth Richardson who became it became a joint venture, 51% owned by me and my business, and 49% owned by Morningstar Inc. We formed this new company, Morningstar Australasia, which was owned as more or less 50-50, and the independent chair was Ruth Richardson. So she was kind of she was my mentor and a fearless whip cracker, about half my height, maybe 5 foot, and I'm 6'4", so it needed her drive. I mean, I'm a driven character, but the value of having an external director and director set is immeasurable. It was exhausting, but there we go. That was how we got there.
It certainly had a great outcome. So thanks for sharing that story. As we sort of fast forward now, I guess, to the business that you've got now, we mentioned at the beginning the Portfolio Construction Forum and the two major parts to it, the CIMA, the CIMA Society, and also the Phenology College. Let's dive into the Phenology College side. Do you want to give us a bit of an overview of what that is and how that works?
Sure. If I may, Fraser, let me take half a second to give some context to that. So the Phenology College is the special interest group that is focused particularly on the individual investor, individual client-facing financial advisor community. And even more, those who are financial advisors who are actively interested in growing their knowledge and their skills and their competence in client engagement, if you like, in the investment space. Now, that isn't all that surprising for me to be interested in that if you kind of wind back to the two or three comments I've made on the way through. I've got a psychology degree. I started a financial advisory firm. I started as a financial advisor. I mean, it's kind of like you can take the boy out of that, but you can't take that out of the boy. And so I have a deep-seated passion around the role that financial advice plays. I have an abhorrence openly of individual investors, individual Australians trying to do their own thing in the investment world. And I also have a really strong conviction around the role that professional management of investment plays. And that's the bit I think that the AMP policy connected me with, my time with Norwich connected me with, this unbundling connected me with. So if you kind of draw this thread through where I've been, the end of that, as much as I say I love the technicalities and I focus on investment stuff, and so the CIMA Society is a really important piece of what we do, in a lot of ways, my love of the role that financial advice plays is what has backed into the establishment of the Phenology College. So the Phenology College is this bundle of support services for financial advisors who are focused on investment to help them do a better job connecting investing with investors. That's what Phenology College is all about.
Yeah, fantastic. And if we break down, as we mentioned before, it's a word that's made up of two things. Behavioural finance being the first part. Talk to me about how would you describe that to most people?
Well, so at the heart of financial advice is core principles of economics, core principles of finance. And finance in and of itself has got this set of principles that are based around what you could call conventional finance or classical finance, some people would call it. And conventional finance and classical finance essentially says everybody is rational and everybody behaves in a rational way. And that's the whole basis of finance theory. But what we all know intuitively, if not through formal training, is actually normal is not rational. Normal is completely irrational. And that is what behavioral finance is about. But behavioral finance by itself is, in fact, a finance discipline that helps you understand what are the biases that people have. And we describe 5 types of biases. We might touch on that in a bit. But what are the biases that people have that move them away from being rational? And everybody has them. I have them, you have them. And there's 5 broad types of biases. And then those biases are what end up informing the beliefs that we have. And Fraser, you and I haven't talked, but I suspect some of our beliefs that we have, you have and I have, will have a commonality because of the culture of New Zealand influencing how we grew up. And then some of our biases will be influenced further by the culture of Australia because we've both lived here for a good period of time. So understanding our biases is critical to understanding how behavioral finance influences what we do and then ultimately what we believe. But behavioral finance by itself is just more theory is just more detail in the finance discipline. You've then got to turn that theory into practical effect, and that's what investor psychology is about. But let me stop there.
Yeah, fair enough. We'll get into that investor, that practical. As I always say, the plan itself is nothing if it's not implemented. So that we'll get into that in a second. Let's dig deep into these biases because I also love them and follow them as well. Let's start with the first one of somebody's values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we've categorized biases into this group of 5. We call them the big 5 bias types. As distinct from the big 5 personalities, the big 5 bias types that ultimately affect our personality, they ultimately affect our beliefs, and values as the first one is really our individual judgment of purpose, of what we hold deeply in life, and it's influenced by our personal ethics. And there's an ability to be able to frame that up and to be able to understand what are the values we hold deeply. And my encouragement would be to all of our listeners is to pause and take time to formally understand what values you hold deeply. And there are lots of tools and services that will help appraise that. We provide an example of that. But there's a whole raft of things that can help us understand what are the values we hold. And maybe some of our listeners don't yet have kids, don't yet have family, but I reckon unless each of us have clarity around the values we hold deeply, our ability to be able to influence people around us for good is impaired. And especially if we've got kids, bringing kids up, I think knowing our own values is really critical. And then ultimately, in terms of giving advice, knowing our own values is critical before we can understand the values of our clients.
Yeah, I agree. I think understanding how you can elicit your own values is really important. It also helps you be able to, think about what your client's values might be. And I love the saying that, you sort of, you don't really know if you're providing value to your client until you understand what their values are, and then you can relate what you do back to their values.
So yeah.
Yep. And the next one, as you sort of mentioned, that values are influenced by was around ethics.
Yeah, and of course, in the FASEA world, we have this harping on about ethics, and that's not unreasonable at all. There's a reason why the end conclusion with FASEA, whatever we think of it, says we need to have a core foundation of understanding of ethics. Ethics is an interesting topic. It's kind of moral principles of right and wrong, and those two are able to be dissected and learned and understood because they're different for different people. The framework is different for different people, and that is a bias type in the sense that some people have an ethical framework that isn't necessarily wrong. It's just different to the ethical framework that others have. And so those differences in ethical framework are going to end up biasing the way we end up concluding our belief set. So values are an influence. They are in turn influenced by ethics. Ethics is another influence set, as another bias type.
Yeah, exactly. And I think of ethics as a more of a group thing as well. The ethics that's acceptable in financial advice is the ethics of the group, not necessarily the ethics of the individual, whereas values can be very individualized.
Sure. But you nonetheless, the ethical foundation needs to be owned by the individual and then expressed in a group environment where you've got shared values and shared ethics. That's where you'll coalesce. In fact, there's a term I often repeat, and that is that, community is nothing other than, and it's a big nothing, but nothing other than a group of people who have shared values and shared ethics. And if you have shared values and shared ethics, you'll become a collective community. So I would suspect that XY is not just about age, it's also about shared values, shared ethics, and that's a core piece, a core tenet of why this group that you're an important part of collect together.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. Takes us to the third bias, which is as you sort of mentioned, cultural.
I touched on that a little bit. So values biases, ethical biases, cultural biases. I mean, we know I spent time a number of years ago running study tours as part of Portfolio Construction Forum to the BRIC economies as they were emerging in the early 2000s, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And the cultural influences on, for example, the Chinese population compared to the Russian population, compared to the Indian population, compared to the Brazilian population, quite different. And similarly, when you synthesize the multicultural environment that is Australia, there are cultural threads that mean that some of those inside Australia, for example, or inside New Zealand, for example, some of those individuals have a certain bias type from their cultural heritage, from the immigrants who came to Australia, came to New Zealand, and some have another. And so understanding those cultural biases is really critical. And for those of you who never lived in another country, you might not fully appreciate that if you haven't integrated a lot with other cultures, other ethnic groups. You might not appreciate that a lot. The little bit that I can understand is coming from New Zealand to Australia and seeing the cultural differences, because there are significant cultural differences. I do a lot of work with the Wayside Chapel in Australia, and we have a very strong Indigenous program as a part of that. And you look at these cultural differences, they are significant. They create bias. Bias is not a word that is a bad word. It's simply saying let's recognize that we have different perspectives that end up making us different. And that's part of the tapestry of life. So yes, cultural biases.
Yeah, absolutely. In Australia being a melding pot of different cultures, it's a really important one. So number 4 is cognitive. So essentially it's the, the financial literacy conversation. How much does my client know and understand? Where am I going to pitch this? Where am I going to enter to the conversation?
There's a really, and most people think of behavioural finance, if I could suggest, Fraser, as just being about cognitive biases. So there's identified something like 160 cognitive biases, and that's just how we're kind of wired as individuals, how our brain is wired up. And the different perceptions we have, the way we make judgments, the way we reason things. And so, Fraser Jack versus Graham Rich will have different cognitive influences or biases in just the way we go about making decisions. And so understanding those cognitive biases is critical. And we hear lots of things talking about the different biases that are cognitive biases. What I'm putting to our listeners today is that cognitive biases are only one type of bias in behavioral finance. Values, ethical, cultural, and cognitive, and the last one of emotional biases are all equally important, but affect how we make decisions in quite different ways and then meld together to make our personality.
Oh, yeah. And you mentioned the last one being emotional, which is generally how a lot of people start making decisions, or that first initial gut idea, thought. And of course, that comes back to a lot of their past and history and whether they've been hurt before or injured or they're, all those types of things. So emotional, we know that people make decisions emotionally. And when it comes to financial decisions, they should be making them rationally.
Yeah. Look, absolutely. There's a saying I remember from, I don't know where, but years back. All of us make decisions based on emotion, but then ultimately backed up with logic, backed up with some reasoning, backed up with some cognitive process. And that's why there's this term called buyer's remorse, because you buy on emotion. That's why the chocolates are by the counter when you go to check out, because you make the emotional decision, but then you regret it later because you've kind of thought it through and thought, I made that decision on an emotional basis. And so our role in giving financial advice needs to recognize these 5 types of biases and how they influence, because we have a duty to understand not only our own biases, including our own emotional makeup and the way we emote. I mean, I can kind of run at the mouth in case the listeners haven't figured, but we need to figure out how we individually emote and how our clients emote. and react, and then how that emotional stuff connects with the logic stuff. So you're completely correct when you say, Fraser, that the decisions that people make based on emotion, our clients amongst them, and how we as advisors or you as advisors look to influence your clients to make decisions needs to be a measure of emotional relevance, but also logic relevance, cognitive relevance.
Yeah, fantastic. And sometimes people make emotional decisions and then they invent cognitive information to back it up just to make them feel better. But that probably leads us directly into the investor psychology part of the equation when we start talking about the psychology of actually now believing in that what we're doing is the right thing for them and implementing it and getting involved in that process now that they understand why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I like to say that conventional finance we talked about is what investors should do. That's the theory. Behavioral finance is what investors actually do. That's the kind of normal person with all these biases we've talked about, for example. Investor psychology is about what investors could do with some coaching, with some behavior change that is appropriate behavior change. It's helping take the behavioral finance and turn it into a practical outcome of here are the things that you need to change. Here are the consequences if you don't change. So it's the engagement relationship. It's the practical application of conventional finance and behavioral finance in the relationship with the client. And that's why I really like this notion of phenology being part behavioral finance, as having competence around the core knowledge pieces, those 5 bias types and so on, building up your knowledge there, but also building up your skill in being able to engage with clients through that investor psychology set of activities, through skills development in engaging with clients and understanding yourself.
So this is the sets and reps conversation, right? The actual doing the work, creating new habits, forming new habits, becoming actually transforming into something different.
That's right. In a maybe physical activity sense, it's kind of understanding, e.g., what is lactic acid, and how does lactic acid form?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the behavioral finance side, and then the investor psychology side is now I need to know how to cool down, how to manage my behavior in my exercise regime so I cope with lactic acid. I know what it is that's coming and I know how to cope with it and manage it. I know how to manage my behavior. Yep. So that's why the two are critical. If all we do is learn behavioral finance stuff, all we've got is a head packed full of, now I understand there's 5 bias types. Well, what the heck does that mean when it comes to your practicing? Yep. All you know is about lactic acid. You don't know about how to actually manage it in a practical sense.
Yeah, fantastic. So in keeping with that theme, we've kind of just described the theory behind what the phenology college is, but the practical side of it is broken down into you've got 6 main parts of that as well. So let's, in the theory of exactly what we were just saying, let's talk about the 6 main parts of that. So you start with a few webinars or Zoominars, I think you like to call them.
Yeah. I like kind of quirky words, and so we don't have webinars. We have Zoominars.
Yeah.
And I always start a Zoominar with the OK Zoomer. Yeah. So the Phenology College, Fraser, is a program that's got a whole array of different tools and services and courses and shorter education pieces, longer education pieces, and it starts with a self-assessment that is complementary called the Phenology Benchmarking Indices, or the FBI, and that shows kind of how quirky I am, because the guy who heads the FBI research I call Agent Hampshire. His name's Rob, but I like calling him Agent Hampshire because he's in charge of the FBI. Yeah. And Phenology Benchmarking Indices is a self-assessment tool to allow, it's only accessible by practicing financial advisors. And it's designed to help a financial advisor understand the gaps, in a sense, of their knowledge through self-assessment across a whole array of issues in the phonology space, behavioral finance, investor psychology space. So it's a self-assessment tool that allows financial advisors to say, okay, let me get a handle on where I'm at the moment. And then it ends up mapping to subsequent suggestions for continuing education, personal professional development in the phonology space. So inside Phonology College is this array of things. You can access those things without being part of Phonology College. But to get the composite value out of it, the phonology benchmarking indices is the framework that allows you to capitalize and maximize on what's inside Phonology College. And then there's a whole bunch of things that you only get if you've done the FBI, including complimentary Zoominars and such like, that are building the special interest group engagement, building the community, to use the word I had before, in the phonology space.
Yeah, fantastic. I do love quirky words as well, by the way. I think the Zoomers is a great thing. Great for ex-Zoomers, Y-Zoomers, and baby Zoomers.
Thank you, Fraser.
No problems. Now, the FBI, we might get into a little bit more in a second, but I wanted to touch on the fact that you've got some accreditations in there, as well as a physical summit.
We do. The way Portfolio Construction Forum has evolved all of its programs is to distinguish between a set of hybrid programs. Now, a lot of organizations, universities, etc., run hybrid programs now. The hybrid programs the forum runs are a little bit different in the sense that they are designed to be an in-studio audience. So every program we run has, in effect, a TV studio. We have an in-studio audience, and then we have a whole array of connected boardrooms or groups. So it tends to be our lowest preference to have those involved with our hybrid programs sitting in their own office by themselves. That doesn't foster community. It doesn't foster the kind of interaction that's necessary. So we have a Sydney-based studio, which can hold a couple of hundred people. And then we have a set of boardrooms that we connect people with. And some of them are advisory groups who say, okay, we're in Port Macquarie, we're in Cairns, we're in, in New Zealand. We've got a group in Singapore who now meet. And they collect together in a boardroom or in an office room with somewhere between half a dozen and 10 or 12. There's 2 or 3 of these remote groups that have had 20 or 30 people in a hotel room, in a kind of seminar room. And so that's how we run a hybrid program. So I'd really encourage any of you participating in what we call Phonology Summit to not think of it, if you're not able to attend the studio, as something that you're going to be stuck away in your own office, but rather something that we are taking active steps to make sure you are part of a small group interaction session. So that's the hybrid programs we run. Then we have some Zoominars, which are in fact, you could meet as a group, but they're just a short 2-hour burst. We run those once a month. And so the phonology Zoominars. Then we have some courses that are individual self-study. So one of them we call BFI in Practice. So BFI is the short term for behavioural finance. It's kind of separated out the behavioural finance piece. So we have about a 15-hour or so BFI in Practice program. We have another program that's Investor Psychology in Practice. And Investor Psychology in Practice has got a small amount of lecture stuff, and a majority of stuff is masterclass activity. So that's kind of a quick burst across what's inside Phonology College.
Yeah, fantastic. And now let's get into the FBI piece of it. Why is benchmarking such an important piece of this puzzle?
Well, one of the things, Fraser, that is implicit but ends up not being explicit in, for example, all the regulatory requirements, the setting out of a learning plan, an education plan. It's all very well you just, as an advisor, saying, okay, well, in the next period of time, I'm going to pluck this, and this. I think I'll do that. I'll go to 3 conferences. I'll do this. I'll do that. I'll do the next thing. But how do you know they actually fit with what your gaps are? Yes, you want to focus on some things that are interesting, but you also want to make sure that you are managing exposed weaknesses, known weaknesses, or alternatively, that you are overtly disclosing, this is an area I'm weak in. But how do you know that you're weak? How do you know you're strong? How do you have this? It's like a fitness test. It's like going for a med. It's like going to the Institute of Sport. You get in, but before you get in, or you go to the army, before you get it, they're going to have a whole set of tests, brain scans, and blah, 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 to say, okay, let's benchmark where you're up to compared to what we need to get to where we want to go. And in a sense, it's practicing what the advisor preaches by saying, well, how much are you going to invest in yourself, benchmarking yourself against best practice across a whole array of things? That's what the phonology benchmarking indices are about. And I I really like it, called the FBI. So I really like the FBI because it is doing the deep investigation into, okay, where are you? What's your status? Where are your weaknesses? Where are your strengths? What are your gaps? And then helping you figure out, okay, what are the things you need to do to backfill and to set out a learning plan that's got some structure to it, rather than just sort of some guesswork or some character in the licensee that says, oh, I reckon you could do this, that, and the next thing. It's a bit weak. Well, what's the proof? What's the evidence that shows that's where you're weak, that's where you're strong? That's what the FBI does.
Yeah, fantastic. So in normal CPD world, it's around saying, oh, let's set up a plan for everybody. But the FBI is really just saying, let's set up an individualized learning plan that is completely structured to where that person is at the time.
Well, that's right. And then the nice cherry on the top, Fraser, is you get some CPD points for doing the FBI. So you kind of can get, which the forum manages a CPD program, and so it means you can get CPD for learning how to get CPD. So I shouldn't say that too loud, but it's totally legitimate. You are self-assessment is a valid activity in learning terms. So you get CPD for doing an assessment.
Fantastic. And so after the assessment, then you can focus on the areas that you're going to grow the most in.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you mentioned that you do look after CPD as well. How does that work?
So Portfolio Construction Forum manages a curriculum of content. We've talked about that. And we curate it into a whole set of different programs. We've kind of talked about that ends up with the SEMA Society and the Phonology College. But ultimately, there's an absolutely fundamental requirement for everybody to both have CPD hours tracked, but there's also a passion that people have to see, well, how am I going? How much have I done here? How much have I done there? It's the same as, the rugby players or the footy players having this little bleeper on the back of their neck in their jersey, not embedded, that they run around with. It says, well, you've run here, you've run there. Well, that's the CPD thing. So we have an accreditation program. It's connected with, we have a team of people who manage accreditation. The Financial Planning Association recognised it. When we manage accreditation, we manage it across 20 different designations. That's unique. I'm not aware of any other organisation that maps one accreditation learning activity to 20 different designations, be that AFA, FPA, SMSF Association, FASEA, ASIC, the whole shebang, Financial Markets Authority in New Zealand. I hope you like the way I'm keeping on plugging New Zealand on the way through this, Fraser.
That's fantastic.
I want to get some more XY members in New Zealand for you.
Fantastic. Let's do it.
So we've got a bundle of New Zealanders who come to Phonology College, so we should tell them about this. Anyway, we manage that accreditation, and then it drops into a reporting portal called MyCE. And inside MyC, it's got your learning plan, it's got all your stuff, all the stuff you've done. You can add your own content in there if you want. And then if you want to export it to another thing that your licensee says you must report it into this or that, but you've got managed for you your own CPD accreditation record. You've put in your own content if you want to manually. You've got content from the forum, content from Phonology College, content from our partners who are education partners. So there's a whole raft of fund companies and such like who run their own programs that we accredit. It cross-links to FPA if you're a member of FPA and you need to report to them. So that's called MyCE. So a core part of what we do is accreditation management, and that's very different from our if you like, education content that we run that is our own, like is inside Phonology College.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, there's a lot going on, obviously. What have you got coming up, though? What any plans or changes for the future?
Look, after all this talk, I was thinking of having a rest for a while. We've got 2 or 3 things. We run a monthly Zoominar. Next one's 25th of June. Happy to tell you what that is. It's got some more phonology content in it. We've got a fellow called Herman Brody. He's an exceptional communicator based out of Birmingham in the UK. I hope Herman doesn't listen to this, but you wouldn't think that much came out of Birmingham. Although, how many of you...
Commonwealth Games, aren't they?
Yeah, Birmingham netball was there, and also wasn't the Peaky Blinders? Has anybody ever seen that series?
Oh, yes.
That is just amazing. Yeah. I think that was up in the Birmingham area.
It was in Birmingham, you're right.
Anyway, Herman is not at all like the bloke from Peaky Blinders. He is an exceptional communicator and has got a specialty in behavioural finance. So he is the lecturer for the BFI and Practice learning program, certificate program. So he's one of the presenters, and then we've got Professor Ron Bird as another. So that's the next Zoominar. In August, we have a program that is called Strategies Conference, which is investment strategies. In October, we have Phonology Summit, the 16th of October, I believe it is. So we have a constant array of things just rolling through, focused on some aspect of investing, a chunk of it phonology, some of it investment markets. We run a program in February called Market Summit, which is a hybrid program. We run a program called Research Roundtable every month, which is a deep dive into an investment strategy. So there's a lot of stuff going on, Fraser.
Yeah, there certainly is. And if people want to find a bit more about it all, what's the best way for them to find out?
We have a URL that ends with .edu.au, or in New Zealand, .ac.nz. So academic.New Zealand or education.Australia. So it's Portfolio Construction Forum, big long word. The word forum is in there, it makes it longer, but it's meant to convey community. So Portfolio Construction Forum.edu.au or .ac.nz. That's how you find out stuff. Or, bang me an email. I'm very happy to respond to anybody. I'm on LinkedIn. Link in with me. Very happy. To be honest, LinkedIn is where I connect with most people in a quick message. So find me on LinkedIn, Graham Rich, and connect with me, and I'll let you know what the stuff is. That's perhaps easy. We put out a lot of stuff through LinkedIn. And that's the stuff, Fraser.
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much, Graham, for coming on, telling us your story and all of the amazing work you're doing at the moment and continue to do. So really appreciate it.
Fraser, I'm delighted. I mean, I know I do talk a bit, but I love what I do, and I really, really enjoy engagement with the advisor community in whatever way. We've got a few kind of quirky, distinct ways we do things, but delighted to be connecting with your audience, and thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you. Well, there you have it, another episode of the XY Advisor Podcast. I'm Fraser Jack, and I'm joined by Emily Blanche. G'day, Em.
Hey, Fraser, how's it going?
I'm wonderful. Thank you for asking.
Fabulous.
It's a good time of the week. We do the shout-outs and we get to shout out some really cool stuff that's going on in the community. So let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay, today's shout out, I should say, goes to the Ethics Committee. So they have put together a new determination. So it was around a couple who have separated but have an SMSF. And is the advisor still able to be an advisor for both of the couples as acting for the SMSF? So quite a bit of background. They really went into detail and really dissected this ethical situation and came up with their determination. And I really enjoyed this one because this is a topic that comes up quite regularly on the platform, is how can you handle those situations when you have a couple that are separating. So yeah, shout out to the Ethics Committee. And just a reminder to anyone who is facing an ethical dilemma, you can go to xyadvisor.com/ethics and submit that ethical dilemma and get a peer-reviewed determination to help you guide your direction and provide some support. So shout out to the Ethics Committee. And if you are facing an ethical dilemma, highly recommend jumping on and seeking some help.
Fantastic. And if you're interested in finding out about the results of that, jump on again, have a look, and there'll be more results posted as they come out.